Good morning. Thank you for joining. We will get started in a moment, just making sure some more attendees have a chance to join. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the information session on the Capital Modernization Project or the proposed capital rule consultation. My name is Christina Panaggio. I'm one of the engagement specialists here at BCFSA. I'll get us started and situated with some pointers about the format of this Zoom webinar session. Today's webinar is scheduled for 60 minutes, but depending on the number of questions, we may finish early. At the same time, if we don't have enough time to address all of your questions, we will respond to you during the next session. Your microphones have been muted and you are in listen-only mode. Similarly, you will not be on camera as your video is off. At the bottom of your screen, you will see two icons. The Q&A function, this is where you can submit your questions. Please don't use the chat function to submit your questions so that we don't miss them and so that they are saved in Zoom so that we can respond to you later. As you are in listen-only mode, your questions will need to be typed into the Q&A. And you're welcome to also use the chat function to send a note directly to the panelists on today's call. There will be time at the end of the presentation for the Q&A period. Finally, we will be recording today's session and it will be available on our website as soon as possible. Next slide. Before we begin today, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered here on the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations people, who have been stewards of this land which we all call home for many generations. While we meet today on a virtual platform, many of us are in different locations throughout the province, and I would like to encourage you to take a moment to reflect and acknowledge the traditional territory you may be calling in from. Next slide. I would like to introduce you to the speakers here today. Nez Aquino, BCFSA's Senior Vice President, Financial Institutions, is the executive sponsor for the Capital Modernization Project. Prior to joining BCFSA, Nez held the Chief Operating Officer position at Global Risk Institute in financial services in Toronto. She also held progressively senior roles at Vancity since 2006, and as its Chief Risk Officer, she shaped the risk management framework of the organization, managing all elements of current and emerging risks. Rebecca Lowry, our Director of Reporting and Risk Assessment, is the project sponsor and a familiar face throughout our engagement during the project. No introduction needed. And Carrie Tuvey is our Manager of Policy in our Policy and Regulations programs. Carrie is the rule drafting lead for the project. Carrie joined BCFSA in 2023. Prior, Carrie worked at the Ministry of Finance, where she held the role of Director of Financial Institutions for 5 years. And prior to that, she worked as a financial and corporate sector policy at the Financial and Corporate Sector Policy Branch since 2008. Most recently, Carrie led the review of the Financial Institutions Act and Credit Union Incorporation Act. She holds a law degree and Master's of Arts in Indigenous Governance from the University of Victoria. And now I'll pass the presentation to Nez to start.
Thanks very much, Christina, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the information session on the launch of the Capital Rule. We have quite a bit of ground to cover today, which we will endeavor to cover in the first about half of this meeting, and then we'll open the floor for your questions. We'll cover a general overview of the project, a bit of a background, a history of how we got here, what point we are in our journey. We'll cover the rule at a high level, explain next steps, and open it for your questions. Next slide, please. And the next one. Yeah, thank you. So, as many of you may know, the existing version of the capital regulation, the capital requirements regulation, was first introduced in 1990, and it has not changed since. So over the course of the last 35 years, while the environments in which we operate have shifted significantly, while we have experienced various crises, either in our province, in Canada, or globally, the capital regulation has remained the same. During that period, the complexity of the products and services offered by credit unions have shifted. There's been substantial consolidation within our segment or even across other credit unions, in Canada. The competitive pressures we face today are certainly different than what we faced 10, 20, 30 years ago. And the way we define risk, either in its current form or emerging risks, look very different today than we would have considered 10, 20 years ago. Next slide, Christina. So, what are we trying to get out of this project, and why have we been working on this for the last few years? Many of you again know that the work began in all earnest at the end of 2022, and it's certainly been accelerated by the events of some bank failures in the US that happened through Silicon Valley Bank and others that kind of put a catalyst to the acceleration of the work. But even without those changes in our environment, it is certainly a fact that the way we thought about capital is now shifting. When we look at the developments in international regulatory standards, when we look at how Basel III thinks about capital, OSFI, and other leading provincial regulators in Canada, there is certainly an element of defining the capital in terms of its ability to absorb losses for the credit union, if and when that occurs. There's a requirement to define it in terms of access to capital, its tangibility. And some of these elements look certainly dated in the way that the capital framework has been established 35 years ago. So for example, and I know we've discussed this with the sector for the last couple of years, what we considered accessible tangible capital in the form of system earnings, the earnings of Central One, the earnings of Stabilization Central, etc., are in fact not tangible and accessible in the event of a failure for a credit union. So we removed that from the new definition of the capital rule. We also we went to great length to make sure that we are associating the business activity of the credit union with the risk that comes with that activity. What I mean by that is, instead of painting with a very broad brush, for example, all of the commercial loans with the same risk weighting, we are now very deliberate in defining what kind of commercial lending results in what kind of risk for the credit union, and therefore should have an associated capital allocation for that. The same goes with residential mortgages, of course. And so there's been some additions, there's been some removals, and there's been a lot of more detail in the way we think about capital. But all along, the goal is to make sure that we have a capital framework that is tangible, accessible during crisis, and has the ability to absorb the losses that may be experienced by the credit union. So we really thought through the nature of that capital, the complexity of the business activity, the size and scope of BC credit unions, and all of that went into the capital rule that we published for your review a couple of weeks ago. Next slide. Now, I was not here throughout the journey. As you know, I've been with BCFSA for about 6 months now, but I was on the other end when I was at Vancity, and I know for sure that BCFSA has conducted at least 50 meetings with the sector on the consultation phase. We heard your concerns about the need for some clarity and simplicity, maybe some implementation challenges, because it's not possible to go from the current framework of the capital to the new world quickly, right? It requires some work to be done by each credit union, and we took that into account in the way that we consider timelines. Many of you expressed interest in support for a phased implementation, which we have also taken into account. And we endeavored to do this in as a collaborative manner as possible, reflecting the feedback that we heard throughout the project into the new capital rule. And of course, going forward, now that we're starting what we consider to be the final consultation phase of the project, which will take the remaining 60 days, the next 60 days, we welcome your comments and feedback as we go through the review. Many of you would also know this, but maybe for added clarity, the BCFSA does not actually pen the rule. The rule itself is penned by the government of BC. And so we went through a long period of engaging with the government to make sure that the rule reflects the requirements from BCFSA's point of view. And as a result of that, when we issued the rule for your review, we also issued a number of supplementary documents that explain section by section what we mean by words, definitions, so on and so forth. And Rebecca will cover some of this in the next part of this presentation. So next slide. Right, so we again have taken your feedback into account in reflecting it into the review. We've addressed your feedback throughout the cycle of this capital rule. And I think today marks another major milestone. We are now entering the final consultation phase of the rule. As you know, we held already many consultation meetings and periods in the earlier days, and now we're entering the last chapter. But again, we welcome your feedback on the entirety of the rule. We invite you to review the entirety of the rule. It's a long document as you reflect on the feedback to give to BCFSA. I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca now.
Thank you, Nez. So we've talked a little bit about the purpose, the objective, and some of the work that we've done on the capital modernization project to get to where we are. So let's dig into that a little bit more and look at where we are today. So you're probably all very familiar with this particular slide. We've talked a lot about the different phases of this project. As you all very well know, the project began back in 2021, followed by extensive stakeholder engagement starting in 2022. The stakeholder engagement part was a really key priority as we walked through this project with the credit unions. As Nez mentioned, there were extensive touch points with the credit unions, both through our working group consultations, our consultation on the general framework. We've had a number of individual sessions with credit unions as well as larger sector-wide sessions. We've taken all that feedback back, and now we are at that consultation period for the rule itself in phase 3, as well as walking through some of the implementation work for phase 4 to get ready for the rule, and that involves the largely parallel reporting at this point. So this gives a little bit of an overview of the project itself and reflects our commitment to transparency and collaboration in order to make sure that the credit unions are ready for this new rule in January 2027. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we have been engaging extensively with the credit unions throughout this process, and we appreciate all the feedback that we've received. We've had numerous sessions with both individual credit unions as well as larger stakeholder and sector-wide consultation sessions. We have received feedback across all of these different venues and taken that feedback back. And that feedback, the consultation feedback, has really helped to shape this rule itself and ensure it reflects the realities of BC credit unions. As I mentioned on the earlier slide, we're currently in the rule development phase, and we're going to be continuing after that with template and guideline consultations next year. We really value the feedback of the credit unions and all stakeholders here today, and we really look forward to the ongoing dialogue as we move forward towards implementation. Next slide, please. So this gives a little bit of an overview of the consultation timeline. As you can see, we kicked off the consultation period last week for the capital rule, and we published an advisory as well as a number of documents at that time. So there's a draft rule that's been published and some supporting documents to go along with that, and we'll go through that in a little bit here. You can find all of that on our website, as well as there was an email sent out to all credit unions and all external stakeholders last week. For this consultation session, we're going to be holding our session today, but we're also going to be having another information session that's going to get into a little bit more detail and have more opportunity for questions on November 19th. We encourage everyone to sign up for these sessions, and we're asking that questions be submitted in advance for the November 19th session. There is a link to do that in the invite for that session. And this will really give us the time to prepare the thoughtful and fulsome responses to your questions. The rule is quite lengthy, so we really want an opportunity to get those questions in advance for that November 19th session. Once we have this consultation process finalized, we'll be working to take all that feedback back so that we can submit a final rule to the ministry for approval, and we'll go into a little bit more detail on the process for that in some of our next slides. So with that, I am going to pass it over to Carrie Tuvey, and she's going to talk us through some of the process and to how we got to where we are with the rule itself and what's next. Over to you, Carrie.
Thanks, Rebecca. So we can go to the next slide, please. So yeah, when you're looking at the rule, you'll see that it's drafted in a style that's similar to other legislation in BC. And that's because the rule has the force of law, and as such, it needs to be drafted in accordance with the principles and standards of legislative drafting. So the drafting process began in April of 2024. That's when BCFSA began to prepare a comprehensive set of drafting instructions for Legislative Council. And the drafting instructions were based on the proposals that were contained in the consultation paper, as well as the follow-up to that consultation paper. And then staff from BCFSA worked with Legislative Council over the last year to develop the content of the rule based on those drafting instructions. Next slide. So you can see that if you look at the Financial Institutions Act and the Financial Services Authority Rulemaking Procedure Regulation, that sets out BCFSA's rulemaking authority, and then it also sets out additional requirements within the regulation that BCFSA is required to meet before a rule can be adopted. So earlier this year, BCFSA obtained approval in principle from the Minister of Finance that allows BCFSA to consult on the proposed rule. BCFSA is required to consult on the rule for 60 days. After that 60-day period, BCFSA is required to obtain the Minister of Finance's consent to proceed with implementation of the rule. And in requesting the minister's consent, we are required to share with the minister the rule itself, along with written comments received in response to the proposed rule, and BCFSA's written analysis of any significant issues or concerns that are raised in the comments that are provided to us. After BCFSA has requested the minister's consent to the rule, the minister then has 60 days to consent or reject the proposed rule. Next slide. So just to give you a bit of an overview on the structure of the rule. So as I said before, the rule is really structured similar to other legislation that I think most credit unions should be familiar with within the Financial Institutions Act and the Credit Union Incorporation Act. So the rule is divided into divisions, parts, sections, and subsections, and includes various cross-references throughout. As you look at the rule, you'll want to look at the definitions carefully as well. So in general, credit unions should be really familiar with the terms that are used in the rule, but the definitions provide some important clarity on the meanings of words and concepts that are contained in the rule. And then I would also pay careful attention to the cross references to tables that are contained in the schedules to the rule. The tables contain important information related to things like risk-based capital ratios, minimum capital conservation ratios, and risk weights related to specific items. So as I said, the format of the rule should be familiar to credit unions as it aligns with the drafting style that should be relatively familiar to everyone. And as I previously said, the rules are based on the consultation paper that was released in 2023, and then the consultation summary report published in 2024, as well as feedback received throughout the process, including after the formal consultation period. So I strongly urge you to review the rules in their entirety. If you focus on a single requirement without considering the full context of the rule or related provisions, that could lead to misunderstandings in how the rule should be interpreted. So you'll see that we've prepared a consultation package to help you in the review of the rule, as well as to help you to provide feedback to us. The consultation package contains the proposed rule, and then we've also provided some section notes, which are really meant to aid credit unions in understanding the rules. So it's just a bit of a summary of kind of what each section is intended to do. And then we've also included a reference guide, which is meant to help credit unions have sort of a quicker way of understanding where various aspects of the rule are covered, where various topics are covered within the rule. So at this stage, I will pass back to Rebecca to talk about next steps.
Thank you, Carrie. So let's talk a little bit about what comes next. Next slide, please. The purpose of this consultation is to seek feedback on aspects of the rule as drafted that may affect how it is intended to operate or where additional clarity may be needed. You can submit your feedback throughout the consultation process using the online consultation feedback form, and we will be sending out an email following today's session with key documents and links along with the slides to today's session. We're especially interested in comments that help to clarify the rule or identify potential operational impacts. Your feedback will inform the final version of the rule and will be shared as part of the approval process. And just to emphasize again, we appreciate everyone's time and insights. Your input is critical into getting this right. Next slide, please. Our next information session is scheduled for Wednesday, November 19th. Questions for the session should be submitted in advance using the Ask Us form that's included in the session invitation. This helps us prepare thorough responses and ensures the session is as useful as possible. We look forward to continuing this conversation with you as we work through these info sessions. Next slide, please. We've also created 2 web pages to support your review. The first, the Capital Modernization Project page, includes recordings and presentations. And there's also a new Capital Modernization resource page, which offers some quick links and has a familiar layout for easy navigation. These resources are designed to help you find what you need and to support the review and process as we work through the consultation. Next slide. So to recap, please review the proposed rule alongside the consultation package. Submit your feedback throughout the consultation using the consultation feedback form. And don't forget to send your questions for the November 19th session in advance using the Ask Us form. And of course, as always, for any other inquiries, please feel free to email us at our CU Capital email address, and we'll have that on the next slide. Okay. So at this point in time, we are going to open it up for some questions from the participants today. As Christine mentioned at the beginning of the session, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen for any questions at this point. For any additional questions that come up following today's session, please do submit those. We'll be holding our follow-up information session on November 19th as well. And any questions that we don't get through today, we'll make sure to address at the November 19th session as well. Okay. So we do have a couple of questions. We have a question regarding asking for an approach or any tips on effectively reviewing the rule. It's quite lengthy, and I am going to pass that question over to Carrie.
Thanks. So as I said, the rule was drafted according to the same legislative standards that apply to other statutes. But it should be, I think as long as you kind of look at it in its context, you should be able to, it should be attainable for everyone to be able to get through. And as I also said, we did prepare some additional materials that were provided in the consultation package that are intended to aid in the review. So I'd really encourage readers to look at the section notes alongside the rule itself. The section notes provide, as I was saying before, sort of a short summary of each section of the rule. And as mentioned, the rule does need to be looked at in its entirety, as some topics are addressed in multiple sections. And that's where the rule reference list can really help credit unions to understand where various topics are covered within the rules. So it provides a bit of a navigational tool for everyone. And then again, just to emphasize, the content of the rule is consistent with the consultation paper and summary report. So the topics and the breakdown of topics should be broadly familiar to credit unions.
Thank you, Carrie. We also have a question about the self-assessment tool and parallel reporting and how that connects with this consultation and the draft rule that we've published for consultation. And so there's some questions about whether there are any changes to the self-assessment tool. And can we assume that the tool itself doesn't align with the draft rule itself? So thank you for that question. That's a really good question. And I just want to talk a little bit about the purpose of the self-assessment tool. This is a transitional tool. It was based on the consultation paper and summary reports that we have published to date. And as noted, in the summary report, we committed to providing further clarifications and providing additional detail in the rule itself on some of those items. So we are going to see some small changes in the rule itself. So as a whole, the self-assessment tool will align with the rule. It's important to note that the rule is still in draft form. And that's why we're going to consultation again on the rule itself. It's still premature to be finalizing any sort of reporting templates now. So we will be updating the self-assessment tool or the reporting template once the rule is finalized. And at that point, we'll be engaging credit unions again to make sure that the final updated reporting template does tie directly with the rule itself. So there may be some small tweaks once we finish going through this consultation process, but as a general rule, that self-assessment does tie to the framework itself that goes into it. Some of the small details we may add some additional line items to get some more information in that final reporting templates. We may tweak some of the items itself, but it still should give you a really good view of where your credit union will land with the proposed rule. So I hope that answers your question on that one. Okay, let's see if we have any other questions. Okay, we also have a question asking about the current environment. And in particular, we're starting to see increased innovation, growing competition, as well as a push for less regulatory oversight. And so there's a question about why is BCFSA introducing more regulation now? And I'm going to pass this question over to Nez.
Thanks, Rebecca. That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. And we too have been reflecting on exactly that point quite a bit here at BCFSA. Maybe I'll take us back to what I said at the very beginning. The framework in which we think about the adequacy of capital to absorb losses for BC credit unions has not changed at all in the last 35 years. And we now happen to be going through a significant update that is aligned to international standards, that is aligned to OSFI standards, and that really thinks about the true risk nature of a business activity rather than giving very broad categories of risk weightings to the products. So we will push ahead with this legislation that we're going to issue over the next year or so. And we're very reflective of the environment in which we're operating and the implications of a potential lessening burden of regulation for other financial institutions and the implications of that, if any, for BC credit unions. At this point in time, we don't see a reason why we need to change the way we have structured the capital framework in its current form that we have issued to you last week. And again, we are assigning a specific risk consideration to specific business activities. We are removing items that are no longer accessible, tangible in their ability to absorb losses for credit unions. We are removing somewhat random, arbitrary rules as it relates to, for example, limiting commercial growth to 30%. So those types of arbitrary, or they maybe made sense for a long time at some point in time for our segment, but they no longer make sense. And so, we look forward to hearing your feedback as it relates to the individual categories of the rule and how it impacts your ability to do more or less lending, for example. I mean, the majority of the risk, of course, is in credit. In addition to that, when we look at the picture that is emerging for us between the before and after, as you know, you're all doing a parallel reporting under this project since July. The pictures are actually quite remarkably similar between what was showing up as capital adequacy before and after. The difference is it is truly now an explainable, defensible capital position that assigns that business activity to the risk that the credit union takes. So we have not seen a degradation in the capital adequacy as a result of this project, so that's good news. The credit union sector is still well capitalized, and there is still excess capital to do more lending activity if the credit unions choose to do so. And we will be following very closely if any actions are taken, for example, by OSFI in the way they think about risk weighting, and whether any further adjustments would need to be considered for BC's capital regime. Rebecca, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Nez. Okay, so we have another question asking about changes to the capital rule itself compared to the consultation paper and summary report. And so we are going to get into a little bit more detail to talk about some of these detailed items at the November 19th information session. Today's session is a little bit more of a kickoff, but I can provide some examples of that for you today. So as a general rule, the rule itself is comparable to it's based on our consultation paper, based on our summary report. So the concepts in the rule have been based on that. Where you'll see some new information will be in the details. So for example, we introduced the concept of a capital conservation buffer in our consultation paper and talked about it a little bit more in our summary report. What you'll see in the capital rule is the details on how is that going to be implemented. So you'll see the different thresholds within that buffer where different restrictions will be put in place. So those are the sorts of additional details that you're going to see. You're going to see more detailed definitions of the different categories. So while we may not have had some of those detailed definitions in the initial framework, the rule is going to contain some of those more detailed definitions. So those are some examples of some of those changes, and we'll talk more about that at the November 19th session and get into some more of the technical questions at that point in time. So once again, please do submit questions for that session in advance using the link in the invite. And we look forward to digging into those further at that point. Okay. Okay, so a couple more questions coming in. One of the questions is asking about the purpose of this consultation. So it's mentioned in the presentation today, as well as in our advisory last week, that we're primarily seeking comments on aspects that may impact on how the rule is intended to operate. Can you please elaborate? So what does that mean? So throughout this project, BCFSA has received wide-ranging and extensive feedback. So we've had a number of touch points with credit unions, and including working group consultations, etc. And we've taken all of that feedback back. That feedback has been instrumental in shaping the proposed rule and the capital framework upon which that rule is based. Given the depth of engagement to date, we have developed the capital rule, the draft rule that you now see before you. For the purpose of this consultation, we are now primarily seeking feedback on aspects of the rule that may impact how it's intended to operate or where additional clarity may be needed. Some examples of what we're looking for include whether the rules provisions are clear, whether they align with operational realities, whether there are unintended consequences, etc. We have included some specific consultation questions in our consultation package to help guide the consultation process and help guide your review of the rule itself. So I encourage everyone to take a look at the consultation package as a whole, read those consultation questions, make sure you're responding to those, read the section notes that we've provided, and that should help with the consultation feedback and what we're looking for comments and provide some clarity there. I don't know, Nez, Carrie, if you have any other additional commentary to add on that one. If not, I am going to move on to the next question then. There's also a question asking about continuous reviews and updates. So in our advisory that we sent out last week, we had mentioned that there were going to be continuous review and updates to reflect emerging risks and developments. So to respond to that question, while the proposed rule is going to modernize the capital framework, it's going to capture the elements and the intent of Basel III and best practices. The financial landscape is continuously changing. And here at BCFSA, we will continue to be watching and assessing whether changes to the framework are appropriate and needed as we move forward in the future. As Nez mentioned earlier in today's session, we had set our current capital framework and capital legislation in place back in 1990 with minimal changes to it since then. So we are looking to continue to be more proactive in our approach to capital and the legislation and our framework itself as we move forward. I'm going to pass it over to Nez to add a little bit more color on that one.
Sure, happy to. Yeah, so I mean, I think I'm sure we have a lot of participants on this call who are actively managing risks on behalf of their organizations. And I think we'd all agree, whether you're in a credit union, in the regulator, or a part of the government, the world we live in today is vastly more complex than the world we lived in 10, 20 years ago. So it is inevitable that there should be more frequent updates, a bit more dynamic nature of change to the way we think about capital in accordance with best practices internationally. We are always looking to OSFI and the way they adapt capital rules, but always keeping in mind the kind of perspectives we need to take into account for BC credit unions and what is different about BC credit unions and how those rules need to adapt for our segment here. So please expect to see, more frequent changes. And by that, I don't mean, maybe not too frequent, but when it's warranted for sure, we will reflect that to the rule going forward.
Okay, thank you, Nez. So we have another question asking specifically about the commercial concentration limit. And as you are all well aware, we had introduced some interim measures regarding lifting the commercial concentration limit last summer. And we have a participant asking whether that will be continued into the rule. So I do want to make sure that we're clear that with the new rule, that we're the draft rule that you're looking at and we're consulting on right now, this draft rule does not contain any commercial concentration limits. So with the introduction of a much more risk-sensitive framework to risk weight commercial lending, we have really looked to remove some of these more blunt approaches to commercial risk weights that are existing in our current legislation. And you'll see that in the new rule, the new draft rule, it contains a much more risk-sensitive approach to risk weights for commercial lending, and it does not include any concentration limits. So I hope that that helps. Okay, I'm going to give a couple more minutes here. I think we have slowed down with the questions. Okay. Okay, so this is an interesting question. So we've been asked a question in our opinion, what is the biggest difference between the framework for BC credit unions compared to the rest? So I'm going to assume that you're talking about compared to other provincial jurisdictions and other provincial regulators. So with that in mind, as well as to OSFI. So there's a few differences. We've definitely taken a BC tailored approach for this particular capital rule. And one of our key differences is how we are how we've looked at member shares and investment shares and where they're included in capital tier 1 versus tier 2. So as you can see in this draft rule, and we talked about this at our last consultation as well, we are including member shares in tier 1 capital, and investment shares will be included in tier 1 as long as they meet those criteria. And as a general rule, the vast majority of investment shares that exist in credit unions today should meet those requirements for tier 1 criteria. And this does differ from what we see at OSFI and what we see at FSRA. So that's one big difference. Another one of the big differences is we have really taken very much very fine-tooth comb when we looked at risk weights for lending and how does that apply here in BC. So we have applied a BC tailored approach to the risk exposures for lending books, especially when it comes to real estate markets here in BC. So when you take a look at our rule, you're going to see a different approach, for example, when it comes to residential mortgages and the lending there. So rather than just relying on one risk metric, we've included a number of risk metrics. So we're really looking at the different risks that BC credit unions face, especially when it comes to real estate backed lending and affordability, et cetera, as we look across the program. So those are some of the larger differences. I don't know if there's anyone else on the line has anything else that they want to add to that one. We have another comment in our Q&A saying that another big change is the removal of system capital. And yes, that is definitely a big change. This one has been talked about for many years leading up to capital modernization. Our current CRR, our current legislation does include system capital, and this is an allocation of the capital from Central 1, QDIC, et cetera, that is applied to the capital ratio. And BCFSA feels strongly that this is not loss absorbing capital. Nez talked about this a little bit at the beginning of the presentation as well. And that is another one of the big changes. With all of these changes, however, when we start looking at parallel reporting, as a whole, when we look across the sector, we're not seeing major swings. We have seen that when we look at the CAR ratio, including system capital, the CAR under parallel reporting does come down a little bit across the sector, but that is to be expected given that system capital is not loss absorbing and has been removed. So I hope that that answers the questions on that one. And let's see if there's any other questions. Okay. Okay, so there are a couple questions that we're getting specifically about things like TDS, DSCR, and how we've done the risk-weighted asset calculations. I am going to propose moving those to our November 19th session. We had planned on getting into and answering some of the questions on some of those items specifically at that time. So I'm not ignoring that question there, but we are going to talk about that a little bit more at that session. So I encourage everyone to attend that one, and we'll make sure to answer this question on November 19th. Right. And it looks like there's another question about market risk. And is market risk included as part of the proposed rule? And so to be clear, I think this was reviewed and outlined in our summary report that we had issued at the end of our last consultation. We do not have a capital charge included in this particular draft rule for market risk. So at this point in time, we have introduced a number of new concepts to align this framework with Basel III. And however, we are still providing doing some additional analysis, collecting data on market risk. In particular, the credit unions are continuing to submit QIS data, and you'll all be very familiar with this. This has been submitted the last few quarters, and we're continuing to gather that data, and we'll be using that to determine the appropriate approach for market risk. We expect to issue a consultation paper and engage with the credit unions in about a year's time. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like going forward. So nothing in the draft rule at this point, but depending on the outcome of that consultation and the analysis, we may see something in the future. Looks like our questions, our Q&A has slowed down a little bit here. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up for today's session then. Thank you to everyone who attended today. If you have any other questions following today's session, please submit that in the Ask Us form for the November 19th session. It looks like we just got a question in about subsidiaries. And so we will take that question and include it for November 19th. That one is very, very specific. So we can also reach out to you directly as well on that one. Okay, so thank you everyone for attending. We look forward to our next information session and look forward to hearing those questions from you as we lead up to that.